Alright guys, so welcome to our next lesson here, lesson 5.4. So we've done simplifying, we've done solving with radical functions, and we're going to embark on one of the last things here, which is to graph them. So let's talk about how to graph rational functions today. So the graph of an equation that looks like y equals some even root of x will always look something like this, like half of a sideways parabola. Okay. Whereas if you have y equals some kind of an odd root of x, it'll look the same as the square root, but it also has this other part down here that looks like another half of a parabola just upside down on the other side. And they connect together to make kind of like this little S shape. So really this one just kind of looks like this one looks like half of this one almost, right? So that's the idea there. That's what the shapes look like. So let's go ahead and start off by talking about the graph of the square root function first. Okay. So what we really want to pay attention to here is a couple of different letters. We want to pay attention to the H and the K. These kind of make up our starting point. And just like when we did parabolas and absolute value functions, you're going to take the opposite value of the H, and the K represents whatever it is. So you don't do the opposite of that one, right? And this one, if it's a positive A, it's the right side up, and if it's a negative A, it flips it upside down, right? Now, this one we haven't talked too much about when it comes to graphing, but we will today. Whenever it's a positive number, it just kind of goes in the normal direction. It points to the right. But whenever it's a negative number, that's a reflection backwards, so it makes it point to the left. Now, I'm going to give you guys a table that's going to kind of put all this together, so you don't need to necessarily write this stuff. But basically, if you just take the regular old square root function, which we already know what it looks like from the last slide, if you start subtracting numbers on the inside or adding numbers on the outside and multiplying, it does transformations which will move it around and flip it in certain directions, etc. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look here. So make a table here for you guys. Now, if you have a positive A value and a positive B value, it's going to look normal, like that. And this is what I mean by normal. And the starting point is this left-handed little dot where it starts at. And that would be the H and K value. So whatever H and K are, those are the values that make up your starting point, which is the end point of that arrow there. Now, if it's a positive A, the graph goes in an upward direction, and if it's a positive B, it goes in a rightward direction. So as you guys can see, this one is curving up and to the right. Okay. Now, let's say, though, that B is negative. Well, a negative B makes it go left. So since we still have a positive A, let's say we have a positive A but a negative B. In that case, it's going to go up because of the A, but left because of the B. So it's going to look like that. It's flipped over going to the left. And once again, that point right there is the HK point. Now, let's say we have a negative A. So if you have a negative A, that makes the graph go in a downward direction. So let's say I have a negative A and a positive B. That means the graph is going to curve down and right. So that would look something like this. Now let's say that I have a negative A and a negative B, in which case it's going to curve down and left. Okay? So basically, to graph a square root function, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to plot the starting point. And then based on the A and B values, you're going to pick the correct shape. Now this is only for square roots. We'll get to cube roots in a minute. But there's the process for graphing a square root function. Plot your h and k, and then starting from that point, pick the correct shape and make the rest of the graph look like it's supposed to. All right, so let's go ahead and do a couple of examples to kind of bring that to life a little bit. So for number 1 here, my starting point, here's my h, it's 4, and my k is 5. So that means my starting point is going to be negative 4, 5, because remember, we always change the sign of the h. Right? I'm going to draw a graph. And I'm going to put my starting point at the negative 4, 5. Now, what is my shape? Well, I don't have an A in the front, so that means it's a 1. And I also don't have a B in the front. So that also means that it's a 1. Better put that in parentheses, actually. So since both of those are positive, that means it goes up and to the right. So my graph would look something like that. That's it. So that's the basic idea there. Plot your starting point and then use the A and the B to determine the direction. Positive A means up, positive B means right, so up and to the right. All right, let's go ahead and move on to another one here. Now, let's see here. In this case, whenever you have a B there and a B value in front of the X, we have to do something that we kind of saw earlier this year. And that is we have to factor it out. So when you have a B and an H at the same time, we need to factor out the B. If you don't do that, you'll get the wrong answer. So anytime you have anything other than a 1 in the front, in this case it's a negative 1. So anytime you have anything other than a positive 1 in the front of that X, then you need to factor it out. And here's what I mean by that. Do that and put parentheses, and we're going to divide both of those by negative 1. So if you divide negative x by negative 1, it becomes positive x. And if you divide 2 by negative 1, you get negative 2. So it's the opposite of distribution. We're dividing a number out instead of multiplying in, right? That's the opposite of distribution. So that's what we call factoring it out. So that's the first step. So anytime you have a number other than a positive 1 in the front of the x, you need to factor it out. Okay? Now that we've done that, we can go a little further. Notice there's no A in the front, so we can assume that that means it's a 1. And notice also there's no K, and that means it's a 0. We've seen that many times this year. All right, so let's go ahead and graph it now. My vertex is going to be positive 2, comma, 0. So I'm going to go over 2 and up none. And now I've got a positive A value, so I'm going up, but a negative B value, so I'm going left. So up and to the left would look something like this. And there's my graph. Okay, so I'll say all the stuff again here. Anytime you have anything other than a positive 1 in front of the X, you need to factor it out. Then fill in your missing numbers. If you don't have an A or a B, that means they're 1. And if you don't have a K, that means it's 0. Or if you don't have an H, that would also be 0. So after that, plot your starting point and then find the shape. Let's do another one. Let's do number 3. On number 3, we have y equals negative 2 square root of x and then plus 5. Now, in this case, we're missing 2 numbers. I don't have my b and I don't have my h. The b, if it's not there, we can assume it's a positive 1. And if there's no h, we can assume it's a 0. Okay, so let's go ahead and plot our starting point. The starting point in this case is 0, 5. So right there. Now I've got a positive b, which means I'm going to move to the right, and a negative a, which means I'm going to go down. So we're going to go down and we're going to curve down and to the right, just like that. All right, let's do one more problem here. Say y equals negative square root of Well, went kind of crazy there with my square root sign, didn't I? Square root of negative x plus 4. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. 4 minus x plus 1. All right. Well, first of all, I don't like the order of those numbers. So the first thing I would recommend is to go ahead and switch them around. Let's put the negative x in the front and the positive 4 after it, just so it looks more familiar. Okay? Next, look in front of the x there. That's not a positive 1, is it? That's a negative 1. So just like before, what do we need to do? Anytime you have anything other than a positive 1, you've got to factor it out. So if I divide this by negative 1, I'm left with x, and if I divide that by negative 1, I'm left with 4. All right, and I'm missing my a, so let's go ahead and fill that in. Anytime you're missing an a, it's a 1. So my vertex is going to be positive 4, so we do the opposite, and 1. So over 4 up 1 for my vertex, or my starting point. Right about there. And since my a is negative, I'm going down, and since my b is negative, I'm going left, so it's down and left. So it would look something like that. Okay? That's how we graph square roots. Here's a couple for you guys. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you guys can get the correct graphs for these 3 problems. When you unpause it, you'll see the solution. So for number 1, my starting point was at negative 1, 2, and it's up and to the right because the a and the b are both positive. As for number 2, we're missing the a, so that's going to be a negative 1 there. We're missing the b, so that's also a negative 1. And we're also missing the h, so that's a 0. So if you fill in all your missing numbers, it would look like this. So my starting point is 0, 3, and we're going to go down and left because the a and the b are both negative. Next one. To begin with, we have something other than a positive 1 here. Now, we had that up here on number 2 also, but it was kind of, we didn't need to pay attention. There's only one thing there, so you can't really factor it out when there's one thing there. But down here, we have to factor this negative 2 out of both terms. So if you divide both the negative 2x and the positive 2 by negative 2, you get this expression here. The missing a would be 1. The missing k would be 0. So my starting point is positive 1, 0. And we're going up and to the left. There's my graph there. That's graphing square roots. Let's go ahead and talk about cube roots. Now, cube roots are very similar to square roots. The steps are almost exactly the same in how you graph them. The only thing that's different is the shape has an extra piece to it. So let's review for a second here. So as you guys may recall, every problem had a starting point, right? And that starting point was always hk. Well, the same thing applies to the cube root functions. hk is still going to be kind of like our starting point, okay? However, let's go ahead and do the rest of the stuff. So we said that when a is positive and b is positive, it looks like this, right? Where it starts here and goes up and to the right. And when b was negative, it goes up and to the left. And when a is negative and b is positive, it goes down and right. And when a is negative and b is negative, it goes down and left. So far you guys may be thinking, Mr. Bailey, that's the same chart you did in the last one. You're right, that's for square roots, right? But we're doing cube roots. Well, the reason why I wanted to redraw that table is because the way you draw cube roots is almost exactly the same. The only difference is this, is that every one of these things is going to get a little tail on it that looks like that. It just goes in the opposite direction. And now we've made a cube root table. Because that's the only difference. So it's literally the same. It's just that you add a little tail on it that goes in the opposite direction from the other arrow. And that's a cube root function. Okay? So let's go ahead and put that to work for us here, and we'll try a couple problems involving cube roots. So let's go ahead and do number 1. Now on number 1, we are missing some numbers. I'm missing my a, so I'm going to put a 1 there. We're missing my b, so I'm going to put a 1 there. And since it's a positive 1, nothing else really changes there. And now we're ready to graph. My starting point is going to be at positive 5 and 1. Over 5, up 1, there's my starting point. Now since the A is positive and the B is positive, we're going to go up and to the right. But since this is a cube root, we're going to add a little tail on it that goes in the opposite direction also. And there's the graph. So it's literally the same thing, you just have to add a little tail on it since it's a cube root. All right? Let's take a look at another one. So we have another one of these things where the x is in the wrong spot. So just like last time, I'm going to advise that we reverse that first. Next, let's go ahead and factor out the negative 1. And let's fill in any missing numbers that we have. I'm only missing an a in this case, so I'm going to put a 1. Should have had my cube root. All right, so we're ready to start. My starting point is positive 1, negative 3. Which will be right about there. And it's going to be left and up. Like that. And then we just add a tail on it going in the opposite direction. I ran out of space there, but you guys get the idea. Put more like down there, you're good. All right, let's go ahead and do one more problem, and we'll let you guys try some. So for this one, we have y equals negative, well, there's no a, so I'm going to put a 1. Cube root of x, of b, well, there's no b on this, right? So I'm going to put 1. And there's also no h, so I'm going to put 0. And then it's going to be minus 2. So I've got all my numbers now. Let's go ahead and graph it. My starting point is 0, negative 2. Right there. I'm going to go down and right. And then I'm going to put a little tail on it going in the opposite direction, up and left. And there's the graph. Okay? And so that's how we'll be graphing these things. Let me have you guys try a couple of those. Go ahead and try numbers 1 through 3. See how you do. Pause the video, and when you unpause it, you will see the solution. And I just realized these are all missing something. Some of you guys have already noticed that. Obviously, we want to be graphing cube roots, so there. All right, now we're good to go. Alrighty, guys, so here's our solutions here. I'll let you guys check them out. We have a missing a value, which means that it's going to be a 1, and a missing b value, which means it's also going to be a 1. Starting point is negative 1, negative 2, and it's up and to the right, and then we do an arrow in the opposite direction. For number 2, we're missing the a, so it's a 1. We have a negative 2 for a b value, so we need to factor that out, which leaves us with an h value of negative 1. And then finally, we have a k value of 0. So my starting point is 1, 0, which is right here. And then we're going to go up and left, and then add an arrow going in the opposite direction. Last problem, we're missing the a again, that's a 1. The b is a negative 1. The h would be 0. The k would be 3. So for this problem, we're going to start at 0, negative 3. We're going to go down and left, and then we add an arrow going in the opposite direction. So there is how you graph cube root functions. And that will conclude our lesson for today. And I bid you guys have a good rest of your weekend, and we'll see you next time.